The gold was heavy, cold, and carried the weight of 1,000 sins, but to the girl holding the coffee pot, it looked like a ghost coming back to haunt the living. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. It is truly wonderful to have you here with us today. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching journey of secrets and redemption, I'd love to know, where in the world are you joining us from? Please drop your location in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. It helps us keep telling these stories that need to be heard. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready, because today's story is one that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The porcelain cup rattled against the saucer, a tiny, frantic heartbeat of sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence of the corner booth. Elara Miller gripped the handle of the glass coffee carafe so hard her knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. She shouldn't have looked. She had spent 3 years training herself to be invisible, to be a shadow that moved between tables, a pair of hands that cleared plates and a mouth that offered polite, empty smiles. But the light from the neon open sign outside had caught the edge of the ring on the man's right hand, and the world had simply stopped turning. It was a signet ring, heavy and archaic, crafted from a dull, unpolished gold that didn't so much shine as absorb the light around it. The crest was unmistakable, a mouth sewn shut with silver wire. To the rest of the world it might have looked like a bizarre piece of Gothic jewelry. To Elara it was the brand of a butcher. It was the mark her mother, Sarah, had sketched in the margins of her journals with trembling hands before her accident. The man wearing it didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king in mourning. Julian Thorne sat with a posture so straight it seemed painful, his dark wool coat draped over the back of the vinyl bench like a discarded skin. His face was a map of hard lines and shadows, eyes the color of a winter sea, deep, cold, and turbulent. He hadn't touched his breakfast. He just stared at the steam rising from his mug as if he could see the future dissolving within it. Elara felt the air leave her lungs. Her mother's voice, raspy and thin from the weeks she spent hiding in the cellar before the end, echoed in her mind. If you ever see the ring, Elara, you run. You don't look back. You become no one. Because the men who wear that ring don't just kill, they erase. But Elara didn't run. She couldn't. Her feet were leaden, rooted to the grease-stained linoleum of the midnight diner. The injustice of it, a physical weight she'd carried since she was 19, suddenly flared into a white-hot coal in her chest. This man sitting here in her world, eating her food, wearing the symbol of the machine that had turned her mother into a punchline and then a corpse. Julian Thorne shifted. His gaze flicked up, sharp as a razor, catching Elara's stare. Most people looked away when Julian Thorne looked at them. It was a survival instinct. But Elara was beyond instinct. Tears, hot and stinging, blurred her vision, but she didn't blink. She leaned forward, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap dish soap swirling around her, and she let the carafe tip slightly, a useless, nervous gesture. She leaned in close, so close she could smell the expensive sandalwood of his cologne, a scent that felt like an insult in this place. Her voice was a ragged thread, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling with a decade of suppressed grief. "My mother has a ring just like yours." The atmosphere in the booth didn't just change, it died. Julian Thorne didn't move a muscle, but the air around him seemed to solidify into ice. He didn't scoff. He didn't threaten her. He froze. His hand, the one bearing the heavy gold weight, remained poised over the table, fingers twitching once, twice before going unnaturally still. He didn't look at her face at first. He looked at her hands, reddened by hot water, shaking but holding firm. Then slowly, with a mechanical precision that was terrifying to behold, he turned his head. When his eyes met hers, Elara expected to see rage or the cold indifference of a killer. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he had just been struck by lightning. His skin went a ghastly shade of gray, the blood draining from his face until the scar running along his jawline stood out in stark relief. He wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking at a ghost. "What did you say?" His voice was a low, guttural rasp, sounding as though it hadn't been used in years. "The ring," Elara whispered, the tears finally spilling over, hot tracks down her tired face. "The mouth with the silver wire. My mother. She told me it was for the people who weren't allowed to speak. She said it was the last thing she saw before they took her voice." Julian's breath hitched, a sharp, jagged sound that tore through the silence of the diner. He looked down at the ring, then back at Alara, his eyes searching her features with a desperate, frantic intensity. He saw the shape of her eyes, the specific curve of her brow, and a realization dawned on him that seemed to break something deep inside his chest. Sarah, he breathed, the name barely a puff of air. Alara flinched. How do you know her name? The Mafia boss didn't answer. Instead, he did something Alara never could have predicted. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call for the two large men she knew were parked in the black SUV outside. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers, trembling with a violence he couldn't suppress. He looked at the ring, the symbol of his absolute power, his untouchable status, and for the first time in his life he looked at it with pure, unadulterated loathing. She didn't have a ring like this, Julian said, his voice cracking. She was the reason this ring exists. And I was the one who let them put the wire in the needle. He looked up at her, and the question Alara had carried for years, the why of her mother's destruction, suddenly felt like it was about to be answered in a way that would shatter the world. Who are you? Alara gasped, backing away, the carafe slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Julian Thorne stood up, the chair screeching against the floor like a dying animal. He didn't care about the mess. He didn't care about the scene. He looked at her with a raw, bleeding honesty that made Alara's heart hammer against her ribs. I am the man who owes your mother a life, he said. And I think I've just realized that I'm 20 years too late to pay the debt. The sound of the shattering glass was the only thing that broke the spell. Alara stood amidst the shards of the coffee carafe, the brown liquid seeping into the hem of her uniform like an expanding ink blot of her own misfortune. She waited for the explosion. She had served men like this before, men who valued their suits more than human life, and she expected a snarl, a demand for the manager, or worse, a cold hand around her throat. But Julian Thorne remained paralyzed. He didn't look at his polished Italian leather shoes, now splattered with cheap coffee. He looked only at Alara. In his mind, the neon-lit diner was dissolving, replaced by the memory of a rain-slicked alleyway 20 years ago, and a woman with the same defiant spark in her eyes who had begged him to be a better man than the one his father had raised him to be. I need you to leave, Alara stammered, her survival instincts finally kicking in. Please. My manager. He'll call the police if there's trouble. There won't be any police, Julian said, his voice regaining some of its terrifying composure, though the ghost of a tremor remained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills, tossing $100 note onto the table without looking at it. And you shouldn't be here, Alara. Not in this city. Not using that name. The fact that he knew her name, not just her mother's but hers, sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Alara lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat 3 miles away. Her life was a meticulously constructed fortress of anonymity. She used a fake social security number. She paid her rent in cash. She didn't have social media. To the world, she was Alara Miller, a high school dropout with no past. How do you know who I am? She demanded, her voice rising. Behind the counter, the cook, a mountain of a man named Silas Stone, looked up from the grill. Silas was a man of few words and many scars, a former heavyweight boxer who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize a predator when one walked into his diner. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped toward the swinging kitchen door, his eyes locked on Julian. Everything all right here, Alara? Silas asked, his voice a low rumble. Julian didn't even turn his head. He was a man who moved through the world as if the people in it were merely furniture, but today the furniture was screaming. She's fine, Silas, Julian said. Silas froze. Mr. Thorne. The recognition in the cook's voice told Alara everything she needed to know. The man in her booth wasn't just a wealthy customer. He was the sun that this dark city orbited around. Sit down, Alara, Julian commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a man who had forgotten how to ask for anything. I have tables to clear, she snapped, her grief finally turning into the sharp, jagged edge of anger. I have a life to live. A life you and your thing on your finger ruined. Julian winced as if she'd physically struck him. He slowly sat back down, his shoulders slumping just an inch, the only sign of weakness he had shown in a decade. Your mother was a journalist, he said softly, looking at the scarred wood of the table. She wasn't supposed to find what she found. The Thorne family, we were built on a foundation of silence. My father, Silas's father. They all believed that the only way to keep the peace was to make sure the wrong questions were never answered. Alara felt the room spinning. She remembered her mother, Sarah Miller, huddled over an old typewriter in their tiny apartment, the keys clacking like gunfire late into the night. She remembered the day the letters stopped. She remembered the day the city's biggest newspaper ran a front-page story calling her mother a delusional fabricator and a disgraced conspiracy theorist. Then came the accident, a hit-and-run that the police closed in 48 hours. She found the ledger, Alara whispered, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. The one showing the kickbacks from the harbor development. She told me she had a friend on the inside. Someone she called the prince, who was feeding her the truth. Julian's jaw tightened. I was the prince. I was 25, arrogant, and I thought I could change the world from the inside out. I gave her the documents. I told her I'd protect her. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, the cold sea in his eyes was replaced by a look of pure, agonizing regret. But when my father found out, he didn't come for me. He went for her. He told me that if I spoke up, if I confirmed her story, he wouldn't just kill her, he'd make sure you were next. So you let them destroy her, Alara said, the words tasting like ash. You let them brand her a liar. You let her die in a gutter while you took your father's seat and put on his ring. I thought I was saving you, Julian said, and for the first time he sounded pathetic. I made a deal. Her life for your silence. I didn't know. I didn't know they'd kill her anyway once the reputation was gone. The weight of the revelation was suffocating. Alara had spent years hating a nameless, faceless system, only to find that the architect of her misery was sitting right in front of her, offering her $100 for a spilled coffee. You're a coward, she said, her voice steady now, fueled by a cold, crystalline hatred. You've been wearing that ring for 20 years, marking people's voices as erased. And you think coming here and saying, I'm sorry, changes anything? My mother died thinking she failed. She died thinking the truth didn't matter. Julian looked at his hand, the gold band with the sewn-shut mouth. It doesn't, he said, his voice hardening again. The truth doesn't matter in a city built on lies, Alara. It only matters who survives. Then why are you here? She challenged. Why come to this diner at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday? Why look for me? Julian hesitated. He couldn't tell her the truth, that his father had died 3 months ago, and since then the silence of his empty mansion had become a deafening roar of every secret he had ever kept. He couldn't tell her that he saw Sarah's face every time he closed his eyes. I didn't look for you, Julian lied, though they both knew it was a lie. I just wanted to see if the daughter was as stubborn as the mother. Tao, you've seen, Alara said, standing up and grabbing a tray. Now get out. And take your blood money with you. She expected him to leave. She expected the story to end there. Another tragic encounter in a city of tragedy. But as Julian Thorne stood up, the door of the diner swung open with a violent crash. 2 men in heavy leather jackets stepped in, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory hunger that made the hair on Alara's neck stand up. They weren't Julian's men. She could tell by the way Julian's entire posture shifted into a combat stance, his hand instinctively reaching for the small of his back. Julian, one of the men said, a smirk playing on his lips. The council noticed you've been taking a lot of morning drives lately. They were worried you were losing your focus. The man's gaze drifted from Julian to Alara, and the smirk widened. He looked at her uniform, then at her face, and then at the shattered glass on the floor. Is this the little bird? The man asked. The one your father said was supposed to stay in the cage? The air in the diner vanished. The secret wasn't just Julian's anymore. The monster that had swallowed Alara's mother was waking up, and it was looking at her. Leave her out of this, Victor, Julian warned, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Can't do that, Victor said, pulling a heavy silver needle from his pocket, a ceremonial tool Alara recognized from her mother's nightmares. The council says it's time to finish the embroidery. No more loose threads. Victor stepped further into the diner, his boots crunching on the shattered porcelain Alara hadn't yet swept up. He was a man built of sharp angles and cruel intentions, the kind of enforcer the Thorne family used when they didn't just want someone dead, but wanted them to serve as a message. Beside him, his partner, a silent, hulking man named Elias, closed the door and turned the open sign to closed with a slow, deliberate click. Julian, Victor said, his voice smooth as silk over a bed of gravel. The council has been very patient. We all understood that sentimental attachment your father had to this particular piece of unfinished business. But you've been sitting in this grease trap for 3 mornings in a row. It looks like you're trying to grow a conscience, and you know how the council feels about weeds in the garden. Julian Thorne didn't move toward Alara, but he shifted his weight, shielding her with the sheer breadth of his shoulders. The cold, aristocratic mask he had worn since entering the diner didn't just slip. It shattered, revealing a predatory edge that made even Victor pause. "The girl is a waitress, Victor," Julian said, his voice vibrating with a frequency that made the coffee mugs on the counter rattle. "She knows nothing. She is nothing to the organization." "Then why are you here?" Victor countered, holding up the silver needle. The light caught the eye of the instrument. It was thick, designed for leather and heavy fabric, or perhaps for skin. "Why does the girl look exactly like the woman who almost brought down the Thorn docks 20 years ago?" "The council doesn't believe in coincidences, Julian. They believe in security. And security means erasing the evidence." Alara's heart was a bird trapped in a cage of ribs, hammering so hard she felt dizzy. She looked at the needle, then at Julian's ring. The silver wire. Her mother hadn't been speaking metaphorically. They actually did it. They branded their enemies by sewing their lips shut before the end. A wave of nausea rolled over her, but beneath the fear, that white-hot coal of anger flared into a bonfire. "I'm not evidence," Alara spat, stepping out from behind Julian. Her voice was trembling, but it was loud. "I'm a human being. My name is Alara, and my mother was Sarah Miller. She was a better person than all of you combined." "Alara, shut up," Julian hissed, his hand reaching back to grab her arm, but she wrenched it away. Victor laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Oh, she has the spark. Just like the mother. It's a shame, really. Such a waste of a pretty face." He nodded to Elias. "Take the girl. Julian, stay out of it, and we can tell the council you were just scouting the target." Elias lunged. He was fast for a man of his size, his hand reaching out like a taloned claw for Alara's throat. But Silas Stone was faster. The cook vaulted over the counter with an agility that defied his age and bulk. He didn't use a knife or a pan. He used his fists, the heavy, scarred hammers that had once won him titles in the underground rings of the East Side. He caught Elias mid-stride with a devastating left hook that sounded like a car door slamming. Elias's head snapped back, his body skidding across the linoleum and crashing into a stack of chairs. "Not in my diner," Silas growled, his breathing heavy, his eyes fixed on Victor. "And definitely not the girl." Victor's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into slits of fury. He reached into his jacket, but Julian was already there. With a move so fluid it was almost beautiful, Julian closed the distance and grabbed Victor's wrist. There was a sickening crack as Julian applied pressure, and the silver needle clattered to the floor. "I told you to leave her out of this," Julian whispered into Victor's ear, his face inches from the enforcers. "You went over my head to the council. That was your first mistake. Coming into my sanctuary was your second." "Sanctuary?" Victor gasped through the pain. "This is a dump, Julian. You're throwing away an empire for a waitress." "I'm throwing away a cage," Julian replied. He threw Victor toward the door just as Elias began to scramble back to his feet. "Go back to the council. Tell them the prince is done taking orders from ghosts. Tell them if they want the girl they have to come through me." "They will," Victor promised, clutching his broken wrist, his face twisted in a mask of hate. "And they'll bring the wire for both of you." The 2 enforcers retreated, the door chimes jangling mockingly as they vanished into the pre-dawn mist. Silence returned to the midnight diner, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of before. It was the heavy, pregnant silence that precedes a storm. Alara sank onto a stool, her legs finally giving out. She looked at Silas, who was wiping a smear of blood from his knuckles, then at Julian, who stood in the center of the room, looking at the silver needle on the floor. "You have to go," Julian said, turning to Alara. "Right now. They'll be back with a dozen men within the hour. My SUV is outside. My driver Ben is loyal to me, not the council." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Alara said, her voice small but firm. "You're one of them. You just broke that man's arm, but you're still wearing that ring." Julian looked at the gold band on his finger. Without a word he gripped the ring and pulled. It resisted at first as if the gold itself didn't want to let go of its master. He tugged harder, skin tearing at the knuckle until the ring popped off. He didn't put it in his pocket. He dropped it into the deep fryer behind the counter. The oil hissed and popped as the symbol of the Thorn Empire sank into the boiling grease. "The ring is gone, Elara," Julian said, his eyes meeting hers. "But the target on your back isn't. I spent 20 years being the man my father wanted me to be. Let me spend the next 24 hours being the man your mother thought I could be." Elara looked at Silas. The big man nodded slowly. "He's right, kid. This place isn't safe anymore. And I can't hold off a Thorn hit squad by myself." Elara looked back at Julian. He held out his hand, not the one that had broken Victor but the other one, palm open, a silent plea for a trust he hadn't earned. "Where would we go?" she asked. "To the only place they won't look," Julian said. "To the beginning. We're going to the docks. We're going to find the truth your mother died for, and then we're going to burn their empire to the ground." The choice was impossible yet inevitable. Elara took his hand. It was cold, but for the first time in her life she felt like she wasn't running alone. As they stepped out into the biting morning air, the first rays of the sun were beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold. The black SUV tore through the sleeping streets of the city, the engine a low, predatory hum that seemed to vibrate in Alara's very marrow. Beside her, Julian Thorn was a statue of shadow and tension. He hadn't spoken since they cleared the diner's parking lot, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror with a haunting intensity. Elara looked at her own hands, still stained with the phantom weight of the coffee carafe, and felt a wave of vertigo. Her life hadn't just changed, it had been incinerated. "We're being followed," Julian said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Elara whipped her head around. Far behind them, two sets of headlights flickered, weaving through the sparse early morning traffic with aggressive precision. "Is it Victor?" "No. Victor is a butcher. The council would send hunters now. Men who don't talk, men who don't make mistakes." Julian leaned forward. "Ben, take the industrial bypass. Head for the old shipyard, third pier." "Sir, the third pier is a dead end," the driver, Ben, noted, his voice remarkably calm for a man in a high-speed chase. "Exactly," Julian replied. "They expect us to run for the state line. They don't expect us to go into the mouth of the beast." As the SUV swerved onto a rain-slicked side road, the force of the turn threw Elara against Julian. For a fleeting second she was pressed against the hard muscle of his chest, smelling the sandalwood and the faint metallic scent of the diner's kitchen. He instinctively reached out to steady her, his hand gripping her shoulder. His touch was electric, a strange, terrifying warmth in the middle of a nightmare. He looked down at her and for a heartbeat the prince and the waitress were just two people caught in a storm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softening just a fraction. "I'm terrified," she admitted, her voice a raw whisper. "I've spent 10 years trying to be a ghost so I wouldn't end up like her. No. I'm in a car with the man who helped kill her." Julian's hand lingered on her shoulder for a second too long before he pulled away, his expression hardening back into a mask of stone. "I didn't help kill her, Elara. I just didn't save her. In my world those are the same thing. But I'm going to make sure they don't get you. Even if I have to burn every bridge I ever built." They reached the shipyard, a skeletal forest of rusted cranes and rotting wooden piers. Ben killed the headlights, and the SUV coasted into the shadows of a massive derelict warehouse. The following cars sped past the turnoff, their engines fading into the distance. "We have maybe 20 minutes before they realize we doubled back," Julian said, stepping out of the car and pulling Elara with him. He led her toward a small, inconspicuous shack at the edge of the pier. Inside it smelled of salt, diesel, and old paper. Julian moved to a loose floorboard in the corner, prying it up to reveal a heavy, waterproof briefcase. "What is that?" Elara asked, watching him with wary eyes. "My insurance policy," Julian said. "When my father died he left me the keys to the kingdom. But he didn't realize I'd already stolen the map." He opened the case to reveal stacks of documents and a digital drive encased in steel. "Your mother didn't find the ledger, Elara. She found the source. The Thorn family doesn't just run the docks, they run a ghost fleet. Unregistered ships that move things no government wants to acknowledge." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Your mother was going to publish the names of the silent partners. Men in high office. Men who wear suits during the day and the sewn mouth ring at night. I kept these files hidden because I was afraid. I thought if I had them I had leverage. I thought leverage was the same thing as safety. Elara stepped closer, her anger flickering back to life. You had the truth this whole time? You let her reputation rot in the dirt while you sat on this. I was protecting you. Julian shouted, the sudden volume making her flinch. He took a ragged breath, his eyes glassing over. Every time I thought about coming forward, I saw the needle. I saw what they did to people who broke the silence. I told myself that if I stayed in the system I could change it from the inside. But the system doesn't change. It just digests you. He reached out, tentatively touching a strand of her hair that had fallen across her face. You look so much like her it hurts to breathe, Elara. She was the only person who ever saw me as more than a thorn. And I failed her. I won't fail you. The vulnerability in his voice was a physical blow. Elara wanted to hate him, she did hate him, but she also saw the broken boy beneath the Mafia boss. She saw a man who had been a prisoner in a golden cage his entire life. Why now? She asked, her voice trembling. Why help me now? Because when you said your mother had a ring like mine, Julian whispered, stepping into her space until their breaths mingled in the cold air, I realized that the silence had finally reached you. And I couldn't let them sew your mouth shut too. The tension between them shifted from fear to something more complex, a magnetic pull born of shared trauma and a decade of unspoken history. In the dim light of the shack, the world outside felt like a distant memory. But the silence was shattered by the sound of a distant explosion. Julian ran to the window. In the distance, the midnight diner was a pillar of orange flame against the gray sky. The council hadn't just looked for them. They were erasing the places they had been. Silas, Elara gasped, her heart sinking. He's out, Julian said, his voice cold again. Silas knows how to disappear. But they've sent a message. There's no going back now, Elara. We either expose the ghost fleet tonight or we die in these shipyards. How do we do it? She asked, her resolve hardening. We need to get to the main terminal at Pier 9, Julian said. That's where the server is. If we can upload these files to the public cloud, the Thorn name becomes a curse. But Victor will be there. He knows that's the only play I have left. As they moved back toward the car, Elara felt a strange sense of clarity. She had spent her life hiding from the shadows. Now she was walking into the heart of them with the man who owned the dark. She didn't know if she could trust him, but as Julian gripped her hand to help her over a rusted pipe, his touch felt like the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. The fire from the diner painted the horizon in a sickly, bruised orange, a reminder that the world Elara knew was gone. They were in the belly of the industrial district now, a labyrinth of corrugated steel and shadow. Every clank of a distant chain or whistle of the wind sounded like a footstep. Julian was a different man in the dark. He moved with a lethal efficiency, his eyes scanning the rooftops. Stay low, he whispered, pulling Elara behind a stack of shipping containers. The terminal is 500 yards ahead. Once we're inside, I need you to handle the data transfer. I know you've been living as a waitress, but I saw your mother's journals. I know she taught you how to navigate the old encryption. Elara looked at him, surprised. You've been watching me for a long time, haven't you? Julian didn't look back. I had to know you were safe. Even if I couldn't be near you, I needed to know the world hadn't swallowed you whole. They reached the perimeter of Pier 9. The main terminal was a glass and steel monolith that stood like a tombstone over the water. Security was light, too light. The gates were humming with power, but the guard shacks were empty. Julian's hand went to the grip of his pistol. It's a trap, Elara breathed. It's an invitation, Julian corrected. They know I have the drive. They want it back. They moved through the lobby, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. They reached the server room on the 4th floor, a cold, blue-lit cavern filled with the hum of processors. Julian slammed the steel door shut and locked it. Do it, he commanded, pointing to the master console. Elara's fingers flew across the keyboard. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had sat at her mother's side, learning the language of code and secrets. The files on Julian's drive began to upload, a progress bar flickering on the screen. 10%, 20%. Julian, Elara said, her eyes fixed on the scrolling data. These names, it's not just the council. It's everyone. The mayor, the chief of police, even the judge who handled my mother's probate. The infection goes deep, Julian said, pacing the room. That's why they had to silence her. She didn't just have a lead, she had the cure. Suddenly the monitors flickered. The progress bar froze at 45%. A new window popped up, a video feed that made Julian stop in his tracks. It was a live stream of an interrogation room. In the center, tied to a wooden chair, was Silas Stone. He was battered, his face a mask of blood, but his eyes were still defiant. Standing behind him was a man Alara didn't recognize. An older man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than the diner. Father. Julian gasped, his voice failing him. He's dead, Julian whispered, shaking his head. I buried him 3 months ago. The man on the screen smiled, a cold, predatory expression. Death is such a convenient mask, isn't it, Julian? It allows one to see who is truly loyal and who is merely waiting for their turn at the crown. Alara felt the floor drop out from under her. Julian's father, the architect of her mother's ruin, was alive. The inheritance, the guilt, the morning drives, it had all been a play. You brought the girl right where we needed her, son, the man on the screen continued. The girl has the encryption key her mother took to the grave. We couldn't crack the drive without her. Thank you for being such a devoted bloodhound. Alara spun around, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and heartbreak. You knew, she screamed. You brought me here to finish what they started? Julian backed away, his face a mask of horror. No. Lara, I swear I thought he was gone. I saw the body in the casket. I didn't know. You're a thorn, she spat, the name feeling like poison in her mouth. You're all the same. You use people until they're broken and then you sew their mouths shut. The door to the server room hissed open. Victor stepped in, his broken wrist in a makeshift sling, but a heavy submachine gun in his other hand. He wasn't alone. 6 men surrounded them, their weapons leveled at Julian's chest. Give me the drive, Julian, Victor said, his voice dripping with malice. The old man is impressed. He didn't think you had it in you to play the long game. Using the girl's grief to get the code? That's cold even for us. Julian looked at Alara, and for the first time the prince looked truly broken. He looked at the woman he had begun to care for, the woman who was the living embodiment of the only good thing he had ever known, and he saw the reflection of a monster in her eyes. I didn't do this, Julian whispered, but the evidence was damning. He had the drive. He had the girl. He was at the terminal. Kill him, the voice of Julian's father crackled through the speakers. He's shown he has a taste for rebellion. We only need the girl in the drive now. My son is a liability. Victor didn't hesitate. He raised the gun. In that split second the world shifted again. Julian didn't reach for the drive. He didn't try to negotiate. He lunged, not at Victor but at Alara, throwing his body over hers as the room erupted in gunfire. The sound was deafening, the smell of cordite filling the air. Alara felt the weight of Julian's body press her into the cold floor. He groaned, a sound of pure agony as the blue lights of the server room began to flash red. The revelation wasn't that Julian was a traitor. The revelation was that they were both pawns in a game that was much bigger than a ring or a restaurant. And as Julian's blood began to soak into her uniform, Alara realized that the only person who could save the truth was the man she had just branded a monster. The server room transformed into a slaughterhouse of glass and silicon. Julian's body was a heavy, warm shield against the storm of lead, and every time he flinched, Alara felt a piece of her soul tear away. When the firing finally ceased, replaced by the mechanical whine of a cooling system under duress, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. Julian. Alara whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out in the dark. He didn't answer. He slumped off her, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. The blue light of the servers caught the dark pool expanding beneath him. He had taken 3 rounds to the back, sacrificing himself for the daughter of the woman he had failed 20 years ago. Look at that, Victor sneered, stepping over the threshold, the smoke still curling from his barrel. The prince finally found something worth dying for. Too bad it's a waitress who's about to follow him. Victor grabbed Alara by the hair, hauling her up. She screamed, her eyes locked on Julian's pale, motionless face. Victor dragged her toward the central console, shoving her face against the monitor where the progress bar remained frozen at 45%. Finish it, Victor hissed. Unlock the deep encryption. Give us the ghost fleet back, or I'll let you watch while I finish him off slowly. On the screen, the live feed of Silas was still active. The old man looked up, his eyes swollen shut, but he seemed to hear the chaos. Don't do it, Ilara, he barked, coughing up blood. Don't let them win. A heavy boot slammed into Silas's ribs and the feed cut to black. You're alone, Ilara, Victor whispered in her ear. No mother. No cook. No prince. Just you and the silence. Ilara looked down at the keyboard. Her vision was blurred by tears, but through the haze she saw Julian's hand twitch. He was still alive, his fingers scraping against the floor, inching toward the steel-encased drive that had fallen near the server rack. This was the darkest hour, the moment where the truth was a breath away from being extinguished forever. Ilara felt a cold, hollow despair settle in her chest. If she gave them the code, the monsters would rule the city for another century. If she didn't, everyone she loved would die in this room. I need the physical drive, Ilara lied, her voice cracking. The encryption key is hardware-bound. It's over there by Julian. Victor glared at her, then signaled one of his men. Get it. And if the prince moves, put a bullet in his head. As the gunman approached Julian's prone form, Ilara watched in agonizing slow motion. Julian wasn't reaching for the drive. He was reaching for a manual override lever at the base of the server rack, a high-voltage emergency shutoff designed to prevent fires. He looked up, his eyes meeting Ilara's for one final haunting second. There was no apology in them now, only a silent command. Run. Julian pulled the lever. The room erupted. Not with gunfire but with a blinding cascade of electrical arcs. The server racks shrieked as thousands of volts surged through the metal frames. The gunman reaching for the drive was thrown backward as the floor became a conductor of blue-white fire. The lights went out. The cooling fans died. The only sound was the smell of ozone and the screams of Victor's men as the surge fried their electronics and the backup gas suppression system began to flood the room with nitrogen, deadly, oxygen-displacing gas. Julian. Ilara lunged through the dark, hands sweeping the floor until she found his coat. He was ice cold. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. Go, he choked out. The drive. It's encrypted. They can't get it now. Find the lighthouse. I'm not leaving you, she sobbed, trying to heave his weight upward. You have to, Julian rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I'm finally paying the debt. Tell Sarah. I didn't stay silent this time. His hand fell away. The nitrogen was filling the room, making Ilara's head spin. She could hear Victor coughing in the shadows, stumbling blindly, his gun firing at shadows. He had to choose. She could stay and die with the man who had finally found his courage, or she could take the truth and run into the night. The despair was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that told her it was over. She had lost her mother, her home, her only friend, and now the man who had tried to save her. She was a waitress with a broken heart in a room full of killers. But as she gasped for the thinning air, she felt something in her pocket. It was the heavy gold ring. She hadn't realized she'd fished it out of the fryer before they left the diner. The metal was still warm. The mouth sewn shut. No more silence, she thought. She grabbed the steel-encased drive from the floor, rolled toward the ventilation shaft Julian had pointed to earlier, and vanished into the dark, leaving the Mafia boss to the mercy of the shadows he had spent his life creating. The shadows of the shipyard felt like living things, reaching for Ilara as she stumbled through the freezing mist. Her lungs burned, a cocktail of nitrogen, ozone, and the raw, jagged grief of leaving Julian behind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his pale face in the blue light, the man who had traded his kingdom for a waitress's life. But she couldn't stop. To stop was to let the silence win. She clutched the steel-encased drive to her chest, her fingers numb. Find the lighthouse, Julian had said. There was only one lighthouse in this part of the coast, the old Sentinel, a crumbling spire of stone that had been decommissioned since the 50s. It sat on a jagged tooth of rock half a mile from the main docks, a place where the wind howled like the ghosts of the drowned. Ilara found a rusted skiff tied to a secondary pier, its engine coughing to life with a reluctant groan. As she pulled away from Pier 9, she saw the fourth floor of the terminal explode in a shower of sparks. The servers were melting. The evidence was burning. but she held the heart of the secret in her shaking hands. The crossing was a nightmare of black water and spray. When she finally dragged herself onto the slippery rocks of the old Sentinel, she expected to be alone. She expected to wait for the end. Instead, the heavy oak door of the lighthouse creaked open before she could touch it. "You're late, kid," a familiar, gravelly voice rumbled. Elara gasped, falling back against the stone wall. Emerging from the gloom was Silas Stone. His face was a map of bruises, and his arm was in a sling made from a tattered kitchen towel, but he held a shotgun with the steady hand of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Silas." Elara threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "I thought they killed you." "Takes more than a few thorn goons to put down a stone," Silas said, pulling her inside. The lighthouse wasn't empty. It was a tactical command center. Monitors hummed on crates, and a high-gain satellite dish was wired through the glass of the lantern room. Julian set this up months ago. He knew his father was alive. He knew the council was coming for him. This was his in-case-of-fire plan. "He's back there, Silas," Elara choked out. "He's at the terminal. He stayed so I could get out." Silas's expression softened, a rare flash of sorrow crossing his rugged features. He knew the cost, Elara. Julian wasn't just fighting for the files. He was fighting for his soul. "He told me once that the only way to break the thorn curse was to be the last one left standing in the ruins." "We have to go back for him," she insisted. "No," a new voice interrupted. Elara spun around. Sitting in the shadows near a radio array was a woman with short-cropped gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen the birth of the sun. She wore a tactical vest over a faded press jacket. "My name is Clara Vance," the woman said. "I was your mother's editor. And I've been waiting 20 years for that drive." The shock hit Elara like a physical blow. "My mother. She told me you died in the same accident." "That's what the Thorne family wanted the world to think," Clara said, standing up and walking toward her. "Julian hid me. He's been funding an underground network of journalists and former law enforcement for 2 decades. We've been building a case link by link, but we were missing the master key. The encryption your mother hid in your name." Elara looked at the drive. "It's not just a file. It's the key to the Ghost Fleet servers. If we broadcast this, their ships are seized by international waters. Their money vanishes. Their protection is gone. And Julian Thorne becomes the most hated man in the underworld," Silas added. "If he's still breathing." Suddenly, the radio on the desk crackled to life. A voice, cold and distorted, filled the small stone room. "I know you're there, Elara. I know you're with the ghosts." It was the voice of Julian's father. It wasn't coming from the terminal. It was coming from a boat very close. "You have the drive. I have my son. He's currently bleeding out on the deck of my yacht, the Silent Empress. If you want him to see the sunrise, you'll bring the drive to the base of the lighthouse in 10 minutes. If not, I'll show him exactly how we sew the wire into the heart." Elara's heart stopped. He was alive. Julian was alive, but he was a trophy in a monster's hands. "It's a trap," Clara warned. "If you go down there, he kills you both and takes the drive. The truth dies tonight." Elara looked at Silas, then at the ring in her pocket, then at the drive. She saw the image of her mother's tired face, and she saw Julian's eyes as he stayed behind in the gas. "He didn't stay behind so I could give up," Elara said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the tremble of the waitress and gaining the iron of the survivor. "He stayed behind so I could win. Silas, how many of those stone tricks do you have left in you?" Silas grinned, a terrifying sight in the dim light. "I've got enough for one last round, kid." "Good," Elara said, stepping toward the monitors. "Because we're not just going to broadcast the truth. We're going to make sure the whole world sees the face of the man who tried to bury it." The plan was suicide, a desperate gamble born of love and a decade of rage. But as the lights of the Silent Empress cut through the fog like the eyes of a deep-sea predator, Elara didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like a storm. The Silent Empress was a behemoth of white steel and arrogance, idling just 50 yards from the jagged rocks of the old Sentinel. Its floodlights scoured the lighthouse like prying fingers. On the aft deck, Julian Thorne was slumped against a railing, his hands bound in front of him, his white shirt now a map of crimson. Standing over him, holding a ceremonial silver needle that caught the moonlight, was the man who had cheated death to rule through fear. Arthur Thorne. 10 seconds, Elara. Arthur's voice boomed through the yacht's PA system, echoing off the cliffs. The truth or the prince? Choose. Elara stepped out onto the lighthouse gallery, 5 stories above the churning surf. She held the steel drive high above her head. In the glare of the floodlights she looked fragile, a waitress in a torn uniform, but her eyes were fixed on Julian. "I'm coming down," she yelled. "But only if you let me see him speak. I need to know he's alive." Arthur chuckled, a sound of pure ice. He signaled to Victor, who stood behind him with a bruised face and a vengeful glare. Victor hauled Julian to his feet. Julian's head lolled back, his eyes fluttering open. He saw Elara, and his lips moved in a frantic, silent no. As Elara descended the winding stone stairs, Silas was already in the water. He had slipped out of the lighthouse's base minutes ago, his massive bulk moving with the silence of an apex predator. Under the cover of the waves and the yacht's own engine noise, he reached the hull of the Silent Empress. Elara stepped onto the narrow dock at the base of the lighthouse. A small skiff from the yacht waited there with 2 armed guards. She climbed in, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Minutes later she was hauled onto the deck of the yacht. Arthur Thorne stood before her, the silver needle tucked into his waistcoat like a fountain pen. He looked at her with a chilling sort of admiration. "You have your mother's defiance," Arthur said, reaching for the drive. "It was her undoing. Don't let it be yours." "The files are already set to a timer," Elara said, her voice steady, her hand gripping the drive. "If I don't enter a secondary code into this drive within 5 minutes, it broadcasts everything to every major news outlet and the International Maritime Court. Your ghost fleet, your silent partners, the names of every man who wears the ring." Arthur's smile didn't falter. "A bluff. You wouldn't risk his life." "I'm not bluffs," Elara whispered. "I'm a girl who has nothing left to lose. You already took my mother. You already took my home. What else do you have to threaten me with?" Suddenly the yacht lurched. A dull thud echoed from below deck. Silas had breached the engine room. "Yow!" Elara screamed. She didn't run away. She lunged at Julian. As Victor raised his weapon, Elara slammed the steel-encased drive into the side of his head with all the weight of her trauma. Victor went down, the drive clattering across the deck. At that same moment the lighthouse's lantern room erupted. Clara Vance hadn't just been watching. She had turned the old Sentinel's beam into a blinding strobe. The high-intensity light hit the yacht's deck, blinding the guards. Silas burst from the companionway, his shotgun roaring. He wasn't aiming to kill, he was aiming for the power relays and the weapons of the guards. Chaos swallowed the Silent Empress. Arthur Thorne scrambled for the drive, his composure finally breaking. "You stupid girl. You'll destroy us all." He reached for the needle, his eyes wild. He lunged at Elara, intending to silence her the way he had silenced her mother. But a hand, bloodied and trembling, caught Arthur's wrist mid-air. Julian had found his feet. "No more needles, father," Julian gasped, his voice thick with pain but resonant with a terrifying authority. Julian used Arthur's own momentum to spin him toward the railing. With a final, guttural roar of effort, Julian shoved his father back. Arthur Thorne, the man who had lived in the shadows of his own lies, tumbled into the black, churning waters of the Atlantic. There was no splash, only the sound of the ocean reclaiming its own. The deck went silent. The guards, seeing their master gone and the legendary Silas Stone holding the line, dropped their weapons. Elara collapsed next to Julian, catching him before he hit the deck. She pulled the ring from her pocket, the one she had retrieved from the friar. She didn't put it on him. She pressed it into the drive's induction slot, the physical key her mother had described in the journals. "The mouth isn't sewn shut anymore," she whispered. She hit the enter key on the drive's small interface. On the monitors in the lighthouse, and on every screen connected to the Thorne network, the progress bar jumped from 45% to 100%. A massive burst of data, the truth of 20 years, screamed out into the world. The ghost fleet was visible. The silence was broken. Julian looked up at Elara, his breath shallow, a single tear tracking through the blood on his cheek. "You did it," he whispered. "You gave her back her voice." "We did it," Elara corrected, pulling his head into her lap as the sirens of the Coast Guard began to wail in the distance. their blue and red lights cutting through the morning mist. 6 months later, the city was a different place. The Thorn name was no longer a whispered threat. It was a cautionary tale, a footnote in the history of a corruption that had finally met its match in a girl with a coffee carafe and a memory like a steel trap. Ilara stood on the balcony of a small, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the park. It wasn't a mansion and it didn't have gold leaf on the ceilings, but it was hers. It was bought with the settlement from the civil suits that followed the exposure of the harbor development kickbacks. Money that was finally being used to rebuild the lives the Thorn family had dismantled. Behind her, the door opened. The heavy, rhythmic tread of boots announced Silas Stone before he even spoke. He looked different in a linen shirt, his scars softened by a peace he hadn't known since his boxing days. "The foundation is officially registered," Silas said, placing a thick folder on the table. "The Sarah Miller Center for Investigative Truth. We already have 24 scholarship applications from young journalists who want to finish what your mother started." Ilara smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her eyes. She'd hate the name. She'd say it was too pretentious. But she'd love the students. "She'd be proud of you, Ilara," Silas said softly. "You didn't just survive. You thrived." "I had help," she replied, looking toward the hallway. From the shadows of the corridor, a man emerged. Julian Thorn walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night on the yacht, and his face still bore the faint, silvery lines of his transformation. He wasn't the prince anymore. He had surrendered his assets, testified for 3 months straight against the council, and served a reduced sentence for his role in the organization's history. He was a man starting from zero, and for the first time in his life he looked light. He walked to the balcony, standing beside Ilara. He didn't wear a ring. His hands were bare, scarred and honest. "The lighthouse is finished," Julian said, his voice no longer a cold rasp but a quiet, steady hum. "Clara Vance is moving the archives there tomorrow. The old Sentinel will be the first place where the truth is never allowed to go dark." He looked at Ilara, and the winter sea in his eyes had finally thawed into something calm and deep. "I went to the cemetery this morning. I left the gold ring at the base of your mother's headstone." "You did?" Ilara asked. "I buried it," Julian whispered. "Under the dirt. Where things that are dead belong. I told her that her daughter is the strongest person I've ever met. And I told her I'd spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever tries to silence her again." Ilara reached out, taking his hand. Their fingers intertwined. The waitress and the man who had been a king, 2 souls forged in the fire of a secret that could no longer hurt them. The romantic tension that had simmered in the dark of the shipyard had blossomed into a steady, earned devotion. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a partnership of survivors. "What now?" Ilara asked, looking out at the city as it woke up, no longer afraid of its own shadows. "Now," Julian said, pulling her closer, "we live. We speak. And we never ever look back." In the distance, the bells of the harbor rang out, not as a warning but as a celebration. The silence was over. The waitress had found her voice, the prince had found his soul, and the truth was finally, beautifully loud. We have come to the end of the story. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey of tears, truth and redemption. This story reminds us that even when the world tries to sew our mouths shut, the truth has a way of screaming through. What was the most shocking twist for you? Was it the revelation about Julian's father, or the moment the ring became the key? Let me know in the comments. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more emotional, high-stakes stories to tell, and we want you here for every single one of them. Until next time, keep your heart open and your voice loud.